All right, welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're basically cracking open the ultimate historical cold case, the fall of the mighty Roman Empire. For centuries, the image of Rome crumbling has absolutely haunted the modern imagination, right? We use it as a mirror for our own societal fears, kind of like a cautionary tale of what happens when a massive superpower completely loses its way. But how exactly did an empire that spanned continents and absolutely dominated the Mediterranean for centuries finally come to an end? So let's kick things off with a pretty mind-blowing number, 210. Believe it or not, back in 1984, the historian Alexander Demant actually cataloged 210 distinct theories proposed by scholars to explain exactly why Rome fell. Think about that. That is 210 different murder weapons, ranging from the highly plausible to the downright bizarre. It just goes to show that historians have been obsessively trying to diagnose Rome's terminal illness for hundreds of years. So who or what actually killed the Roman Empire? With literally hundreds of potential culprits to choose from, we have to look really closely at the historiography. That's basically the study of how history itself is written. We need to piece together the clues to figure out who dealt the fatal blow. Was it a dramatic, sudden murder? Was it a slow, agonizing sickness? Or, was it something else entirely? To answer this, we need to gather our suspects. Let's start by looking at the crime scene, setting the stage for the collapse of 476 CE. Before we can start pointing fingers, we have to establish what actually went down leading up to the supposed death of the empire. We've got to secure the crime scene. The decline definitely wasn't an overnight event. It wasn't some sudden explosion. It was this grueling, centuries-long process. A lot of historians trace the beginning of the end to 180 CE, with the death of Emperor Marcus Aurelius. Over the next few centuries, the empire faced severe crisis. We're talking massive inflation and brutal civil wars. Now, Diocletian tried some sweeping reforms in 284 CE to stabilize things, but the pressure just kept building. By 410 CE, the unthinkable happens. The city of Rome is actually sacked by the Visigoths. And that leads us to our traditional time of death, 476 CE, when the Germanic warlord Odoacer deposed the young Western Roman emperor Romulus Augustulus. But hold on, because here is a massive complication for our investigation. As we look at these suspects, we have to constantly test our theories against a giant control group, the Eastern Roman Empire. The empire had actually been divided into two halves to make it easier to run. Now, the Latin-speaking West collapsed in the 5th century, sure, but the Greek-speaking East, which was wealthier and ruled from Constantinople, survived for almost another 1,000 years, all the way until 1435. So the crucial takeaway here is this. Whatever killed the West somehow totally failed to kill the East. Any theory we look at absolutely has to account for that survival. Moving to our first major suspect, internal decay. Did Rome essentially die by suicide? This brings us to Edward Gibbon, basically the godfather of Roman historiography. Way back in 1776, he published this monumental work arguing that Rome's fall was, in his extremely famous words, the triumph of barbarism and religion. Gibbon controversially argued that Rome's adoption of Christianity preached patience and discouraged active virtues. He basically thought it buried the ancient Roman military spirit in the cloister. For him, the empire just grew too large, became tyrannical, and lost that foundational civic pride that made it so great in the first place. Jumping forward a bit, modern anthropologist Joseph Tainter gives us another fascinating internal motive, but from an economic perspective. Tainter argues that as the empire grew, it tried to solve its problems by just adding more complexity. More bureaucracy, more infrastructure, a much larger military. But eventually, a society hits a wall of diminishing returns. The energy and resources required just to maintain this massive, complex machine end up costing more than the territory can actually produce. Under this theory, Rome literally became too expensive to exist, fracturing under the weight of its own administrative bloat. Okay, but what if structural internal decay wasn't the prime culprit? That brings us to our monocausal assassins: disease, lead, and climate. Historians have lined up a few rapid-fire biological and environmental suspects here. Take the Antonine Plague, which hit around 165 CE. This may have been an early form of smallpox or measles, and it wiped out perhaps half the population, completely devastating the tax base and the army. We also see evidence of severe deforestation and topsoil erosion, which crippled agricultural output. As crop yields dropped, heavy taxation essentially forced small farmers off their lands and packed them into overcrowded, disease-ridden cities. And then there's the wild poison theory. Geochemist Jerome Nyriagu advanced this highly debated idea that the Roman upper class essentially sterilized and slowly poisoned themselves to death. See, they used this grape syrup called sapa to sweeten their food and wine. But because this syrup was boiled in lead pots, it created highly toxic lead acetate. Now, it's worth noting that a lot of pharmacologists and classicists heavily dispute this, pointing out that ancient Romans actually knew lead was dangerous. But it still remains one of the most infamous, flashy theories on that list of 210. But wait, remember our control group, the Eastern Empire? Disease, environmental degradation, lead pipes, they had all of that in the East too. So why did only the West fall? Well, let's look at geography, because it really builds our case. The West was uniquely vulnerable to our next suspect. Most invaders entered Europe from the West along these really flat regions, making mass invasion much easier. Meanwhile, the Eastern Empire's capital was fiercely protected by the rugged Balkan mountain ranges. That geographic vulnerability leads us straight to our most violent suspect, the barbarian catastrophe and the military domino effect. Historian Peter Heather describes this whole situation not just as a straightforward invasion, but more like a totally uncontrollable geopolitical domino effect. Out in the east, the terrifying Hunnic Empire began expanding into Europe. This aggression terrified the Germanic tribes, which ended up forcing desperate, armed refugees, like the Goths, to flee right across the Roman borders in completely unmanageable numbers. Rome's borders didn't just casually break, they absolutely buckled under the sheer weight of this mass, armed migration. The really crucial part is how Rome tried to cope with this. Because extreme taxation and depopulation had totally destroyed Rome's ability to field its own native armies, they were forced into a fatal compromise. They started hiring the very barbarians they were fighting. These mercenaries, known as foederati, were integrated into the legions. But here's the catch. Their loyalty was to their specific commanders and their own tribes, not to the abstract idea of the Roman state. It fatally diluted Rome's military readiness. Now, brace yourselves, because recent historical analysis introduces a massive plot twist to our cold case. What if this wasn't a story of destruction at all, but rather transformation? Enter what's called the late antiquity school of thought. A lot of modern scholars argue that using the dramatic word fall is actually pretty misleading. Instead, they suggest the Roman Empire underwent a gradual, complex cultural transformation into the Middle Ages. Yes, the political authority of the Western emperor vanished, but Roman cultural traditions, the Christian church, and local administrative institutions didn't just disappear. They merely merged with the new Germanic elements to create the foundations of the modern European nation-states we know today. And this leads to, honestly, one of the most surprising pieces of evidence in this entire explainer. When archaeologists look at human bones across Europe from the period right after the supposed fall, they find something astonishing. Average nutrition and human heights actually improved. Joseph Tainter points out that for the average peasant farmer, the collapse of the Roman state might have actually been a massive relief. It freed them from crushing taxes and the suffocating bureaucracy of this overgrown empire. So if Rome didn't truly fall but merely evolved, what does that say about how we measure the success and failure of our own modern societies? As we wrap up these 210 theories, from Given's internal rot to Heather's barbarian invasions to this idea of a late antique evolution, the ultimate takeaway is that history is rarely a simple story of destruction. Human civilization is a continuous, fascinating metamorphosis, and it leaves us with a pretty provocative thought. If the greatest empire in the world didn't truly fall but just evolved into something new, how should we be looking at the future of our own world today? Thanks for joining me on this investigation. Keep asking questions, and I'll see you next time.